Our next speaker this morning is Tara Teal. Tara is an associate professor in the Department of Human Dimensions and Natural Resources at Colorado State University. Her work focuses on improving conservation decision-making through understanding human thought and behavior and through building social science capacity amongst conservation professionals. She works closely with natural resource agencies in the applications of science, social science, to inform their planning, management, and communication efforts. She received her PhD in Human Dimensions of Natural Resources from CSU with emphasis in social psychology, and MS and BS degrees in Fisheries and Wildlife Management from Utah State University.
Good morning. Thank you, Darren. I want to give you a little bit of background to set the stage for some of the research that we've been conducting on public values toward wildlife in the western United States. Few who have been involved in the wildlife profession for any length of time would deny that values toward wildlife and other natural resources have changed pretty dramatically in this country over the latter half of the 20th century. And specifically, we've seen a gradual movement away from the more traditional consumptive-oriented views of natural resources, and along with this has come a change in how the public wants to have our public lands managed. We've seen evidence of some of these changes in the growing interest over time in species preservation, and more specifically in people wanting to have protection of a variety of different types of species. We've seen legislation at the state as well as the federal levels to support this evolving interest. And we've seen a gradual movement away from the sort of traditional model of game management around which the wildlife profession formed in this country. We've also seen evidence of change if we look at trends in outdoor recreation. So Ken Cordell, a well-known researcher who documents outdoor recreation trends, and then also results of the National Survey on Hunting, Fishing, and Wildlife-Associated Recreation, have shown dramatic declines in certain forms of recreation like hunting, and at the same time dramatic increases in other forms of recreation like wildlife viewing. And this has raised a series of concerns on the part of state fish and wildlife agencies who still rely very heavily on the sale of fishing and hunting licenses to support wildlife conservation initiatives in this country. Also, it raises concerns in the form of competition among stakeholders over a scarce resource on our public lands. Another concern that we can think about is the potential loss of a wildlife population control mechanism if we continue to see declines in hunting. In addition to these trends, wildlife agencies face a number of challenges when it comes to wildlife conservation in the West today. We see, for example, changes like urbanization, population growth, and development that are putting dramatic pressures on natural resources and on wildlife in particular. And in many cases, these changes have contributed to an acceleration of human-wildlife conflict. If you look on the graph, or on the visuals here, you can see in the upper left a moose in amongst a series of anglers on the Russian River in Alaska. And in the bottom right, you see elk in a residential area in Colorado. So we see habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and again, that acceleration of human-wildlife conflict tied to some of these changes. If we look specifically at human-wildlife conflict, we see things like wildlife depredation on crops and livestock. I have a statistic here that shows you, the magnitude of some of these impacts. The annual impact from wildlife damage to agricultural producers is estimated to be around $4.5 billion in the U.S., based on research conducted by Mike Conover here at Utah State. Also, in terms of human-wildlife conflict issues, we see losses due to auto accidents involving wildlife. And so here's an example of a statistic: 1.5 million deer vehicle collisions per year in the United States, with an estimated loss of $1.6 billion, just to give you a feel for the magnitude of those impacts. Also, when we talk about human-wildlife conflict, we see nuisance-type situations. So wildlife caused damage to landscaping in residential areas. Also, we see safety threats to humans, direct threats from wildlife, but also indirect in the form of disease. In the upper right, you see a deer that is suffering from chronic wasting disease, a big challenge that the agencies are faced with right now in the United States. Here's another type of challenge that we're increasingly having to deal with in wildlife conservation. With urbanization, increasingly you see a public more removed from direct day-to-day interaction with nature and with wildlife. And in many cases, this has led to a public that's less educated about what constitutes appropriate behavior when it comes to interacting with wildlife. And at the same time, you see a segment of the public that wants to have more intimate and up-close experiences with wildlife like you see here. So this is a huge challenge for the agencies when we think about safety threats associated with this kind of situation and developing effective communication mechanisms for interacting with the public. Also, in terms of challenges in wildlife conservation today, we increasingly see a rise of social conflict. This is evidenced in the increases in ballot initiatives over the last several decades banning such practices as recreational trapping. Also concerns about the ethical treatment of animals. So all of these changes and these challenges that the agencies are faced with are examples of things that set the stage for the work that we were conducting. One of the big questions that was at the root of our work was why has social conflict over wildlife increased? More specifically, how do people think about wildlife, and how do different people think about wildlife differently, realizing that human thought is oftentimes at the root of the social conflict over some of these issues. Also, does there appear to be a trend of change, and why might this trend be occurring? And perhaps most importantly, how can this information improve wildlife decisions? What I'm going to talk to you about today is work that was conducted by myself and Mike Manfredo at Colorado State University in collaboration with 19 state fish and wildlife agencies. This was an effort called Wildlife Values in the West that was funded by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I want to give you a little bit of background, some conceptual background to set the stage for the work that we were doing. We drew upon the work of a political scientist by the name of Ron Inglehart. Ron Inglehart has introduced a theory of value shift, where he talks about how industrialization and the processes that followed have played a primary role in producing the mix of values evident in today's society. And specifically, Inglehart argues that values are shifting in response to changing need states. And he uses Maslow's hierarchy, which we often talk about at an individual level, to think about how countries or societies might be changing. Inglehart argues that prior to World War II, in countries like the United States, values for most people formed around concern for economic well-being and utilitarian needs, so sort of at the base levels of this hierarchy. Following World War II, economic development in countries like the United States elevated people from focusing on these basic life values to emphasis on higher order needs, which he argues are reflected in what he calls post-materialist values. And post-materialist values are spawned by the presence of physical and economic security during one's formative years. So following World War II, we saw a huge amount of economic growth that basically created a different set of lifestyle circumstances for people being brought up at that time period. And so if we look at the values of today, they're more reflective of some of these higher order needs, like quality of life, belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization. And Inglehart argues that this change occurs intergenerationally. So we don't see it within individuals over time, but it occurs over time through intergenerational shift. Also, interestingly, Inglehart argues that this has been associated with the rise of environmentalism and the loss of faith in government. And the loss of faith in government is tied to the idea that institutions change very slowly. And so if we look at the institutions of today, in many cases they were formed to meet the needs and the values of an earlier time period. And so that's how he argues this loss of faith in government is increasingly becoming an issue. Here's just a snapshot of some of Inglehart's findings. He's collected data in countries around the world longitudinally over time. And here you're looking at the relationship between gross national product per capita in 1950, plotted for different countries, against, on the y-axis, the percentage of people with a specific set of values. And basically, the higher up you go on that y-axis, the higher percentage of people in the country that have these utilitarian life values that are reflective of the basic needs on the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy. And then countries like the United States, higher levels of gross national product per capita in 1950, lower percentages of people with utilitarian life values today. And the reason why he plots 1950 GNP against current day values is that's the time period following World War II that he argued that a lot of this change started to occur because of the economic development during that time period. So our study question, drawing upon the research and theory of researchers like Inglehart, we asked the question, as a reflection of broader societal shift, has thinking about wildlife changed from thought rooted in utilitarian-based needs to what we're referring to as mutualism and belongingness-based needs? Our study methodology, just to give you a feel for how we collected the data, we administered a mail survey to residents in each of the 19 participating states. We did a lot of pre-testing and pilot phase work initially, but the actual data collection occurred in 2004 and 2005. We ended up with 12,600 completed surveys returned to us. And that's a relatively large human dimensions investigation. But the point was to be able to collect baseline information that not only represented the Western region, but also allowed us to say something about what was happening in each participating state, so we could actually generalize at that level. We conducted an extensive non-response follow-up phone survey where we contacted a sample of people who didn't respond to the mail survey through interviews with 7,600 individuals. And basically that allowed us to determine if there were differences between those who responded to the mail survey and those who did not. We did find some slight differences. We also found some differences when we compared against census information, and so we weighted our data accordingly by age and participation in wildlife-related recreation participation in wildlife-related recreation. And that allowed us to more adequately represent the populations of interest in each of the participating states. So what are the wildlife values of the public in the Western United States based on our research? First, I'll just briefly talk to you about this concept of wildlife value orientations, which we've introduced to capture the diverse array of values that people have toward wildlife. Wildlife value orientations are enduring beliefs regarding wildlife, and more specifically, they're reflective of broad cultural ideologies that tend to orient our values and provide personal meaning to them around wildlife. And we can look at two classes or categories of thought that go along with this concept. So the first is worldview or ideal world. And this is essentially how we want the world to be regarding wildlife. And then principles for wildlife treatment are guiding principles for how we should interact with and treat wildlife. We can look at two main streams of thought or wildlife value orientations in our society. And this builds upon work of earlier researchers, for example, Steve Keller, who's written at length about wildlife values. A utilitarian value orientation toward wildlife is reflective of what they talk about in the literature of an ideology of domination or human mastery. This is something that they talk a lot about in the psychology and sociology literature as it relates to common cultural ideologies that are prevalent in societies like the United States. Individuals who have a strong utilitarian orientation toward wildlife believe in an ideal world where wildlife exists primarily for human use and enjoyment, and there's an abundance of wildlife for activities like hunting and fishing. And then principles for wildlife treatment are things like we should manage wildlife so that humans benefit and the needs of humans should take priority over wildlife. Individuals with a strong utilitarian view tend to be more supportive of traditional forms of wildlife management, such as lethal control, and they also tend to be more supportive of activities like hunting. The second main stream of thought that we've identified, or wildlife value orientation, falls under this term of mutualism. This is more reflective of the belongingness needs that Inglehart talks about that we're moving more toward. It's also reflective of an ideology of egalitarianism, so equal treatment extended to all, including animals. Individuals with a strong mutualism orientation toward wildlife tend to believe in an ideal world where wildlife are capable of relationships of trust with humans, almost as if they're part of an extended family, and they're deserving of rights and caring. And so if we look at the ideal world, there's an emotional bonding and companionship with animals that's part of it, humans and wildlife coexisting without fear. And then principles for wildlife treatment are things like animals should have rights like humans, take care of wildlife, and prevent cruelty to animals. And individuals with a strong mutualism view tend to be less supportive of traditional forms of management like lethal control. They also tend to be less supportive of activities like hunting, and they're more likely to participate in welfare-enhancing behaviors for individual wildlife. So, for example, feeding wildlife, nurturing sick or abandoned animals. To measure wildlife value orientations, we use an approach that was developed in the 1990s at CSU by Mike Manfredo and other researchers. And basically what we do is we use a series of agree-disagree statements. People rate their level of agreement with a series of statements that reflect beliefs about wildlife and wildlife management. So an example of a utilitarian statement would be the needs of humans should take priority over fish and wildlife protection. An example of a mutualism statement would be animals should have rights similar to the rights of humans. And we look at levels of agreement across the whole host of statements to detect patterns in beliefs that are reflective of specific value orientations. The next step in being able to use this information is not just to look at the wildlife value orientations that exist, but also to look at the different types of people based on the orientations that they hold. So what we're able to do is assign people a score on the utilitarian orientation scale based on how they respond to that set of items. And then at the same time, we can assign people a mutualism score based on how they respond to that set of items. And we look at the scores simultaneously and classify people into one of four types. So utilitarians, this intuitively makes sense. These are individuals that score high on utilitarianism, low on mutualism. Alternatively, the mutualists score high on mutualism, low on utilitarianism. But then interestingly, we have a group that we've identified that we've called the pluralists. These are individuals who score high on both orientation scales. And you might wonder how this is possible. How is it that people could at the same time hold these two seemingly conflicting orientations? And the way we've talked about it, and also what some of our follow-up research has revealed, is that which of the orientations plays a role in an individual's thinking is dependent upon the situation or the context. So for some issues, pluralists behave more like mutualists. For other issues, they behave more like utilitarians. And the pluralists we've also talked about as being a group that is sort of indicative of our society in transition, because they hold both a mutualism orientation that we may be moving more toward, and at the same time a utilitarian orientation that we may be moving away from. And then finally, the distance group of individuals score low on both of the orientation scales. They tend not to have a well-formed value orientation toward wildlife. And this is the group that the agencies are particularly concerned about as we've held workshops about the meaning of these findings. Distance individuals also from some of our follow-up research tend to be less interested in wildlife and wildlife-related issues, and they also tend to be more likely to express concern for safety or fear in relation to recreating outdoors, concerns about being attacked by wildlife, for example. So here we get into the results. Here you're looking at the results for the Western region. So we have about 34% of people classified as utilitarians, 33% mutualists, 20% pluralists, and 13% distanced. So keep in mind these results are weighted by population size to report at the region level. So states like California are more likely to be driving these results. Now the more interesting part is if we look at the findings distributed across the participating Western states. And I know in the back you can't really see the numbers, but if you look at the color shading, the darker the color shade, the higher percentage of people with that specific value orientation type in the state. So for utilitarians, we see higher percentages in Rocky Mountains and Plains states, with the highest being in Alaska and South Dakota at about 50%. Lower percentages in the coastal states, with the lowest being in Hawaii at 25%. Here's the percent classified as pluralists. Same basic pattern, but lower percentages overall. The highest were in North Dakota and Wyoming at about 31%. Now, if we look at the percent classified as mutualist, the pattern sort of reverses itself now. So we see higher percentages in the coastal states, with the highest in Hawaii at 41%, and then states like Alaska and South Dakota that had the highest percentages of utilitarians now have the lowest percentages of mutualists. And then finally, the percent classified as distance, relatively low percentages overall with the exception of the coastal states. The highest percentage was in California at 19%. So the next important question was to ask, are wildlife value orientations changing in the western United States? And as I said, we built upon the work of Ron Inglehart to begin to test some of these ideas. So one of the first propositions is that there's a shift away from utilitarian wildlife value orientations that's associated with a shift away from utilitarian life values, realizing that these things may be changing along a similar trajectory. So here, just like Inglehart plots out countries, we're looking at state-level information. And you're looking here at the x-axis at percent of those with a utilitarian life value, or utilitarian set of life values, according to Inglehart's measurement, and then the percent of people with utilitarian value orientations toward wildlife. And what we see is that states like South Dakota, Utah, Oklahoma, North Dakota, higher percentages of people with utilitarian life values, and also higher percentages of people with utilitarian wildlife value orientations. So one of the conclusions that we can start to look at here is whether utilitarian wildlife value orientations are strongly related to utilitarian life values. And in fact, they are. And while we only have cross-sectional information here, we don't have longitudinal information to actually test the shift, we are seeing patterns that are consistent with the notion that these would be changing along a similar trajectory. And I should also mention, what I'm not showing here is that we've conducted analysis through an approach called hierarchical linear modeling, where we've been able to actually test for these state-level effects on individual level variables. But I'm just showing you the descriptive findings here for sake of illustration. So the second basic proposition is that the shift away from utilitarian wildlife value orientations is associated with economic well-being, education, and urbanization. And these are factors that are indicative of modernization, reflective of the changes that Inglehart describes. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you, I'll actually flip to this one as an example here, because I'm running a little bit short. Here you're looking at the percent of mutualists in a state, plotted against an indicator of urbanization, so the percent of people residing in a city or a large city. And you see that states like California, Colorado, Arizona, higher percentages of mutualists, and also higher percentages of people residing in urban areas. And we see the same basic relationships with income and education, suggesting that there are patterns here that are consistent with the change that we would expect if modernization is having an impact. So basically what happens with modernization is it produces a different set of lifestyle circumstances for individuals being brought up in that time period. And if we take urbanization, for example, we can see how this change might be occurring through that different set of life conditions. So with urbanization, we see that there's insulation from dependency on natural resources. Oftentimes kids today aren't even entirely aware of where their food comes from. Social learning occurs more readily as opposed to direct learning. So we see, for example, that people are learning about wildlife in urban areas through social interactions, discussions with their friends and family members, and also through, media, through television programming, Animal Planet, Discovery Channel, for example, as opposed to through the direct learning. There's also less social support for utilitarian activities in urban areas, and utilitarian activities like hunting oftentimes require more effort. People have to drive further. In some cases, there's more crowding and less success. So we wouldn't expect this change to be occurring at an individual level. Instead, as I talked about before, this change occurs intergenerationally. So we wouldn't expect that if someone suddenly moves as an adult from a rural to an urban area, or suddenly acquires more income or more wealth, that person's value orientations toward wildlife would suddenly change overnight. Instead, it might be the value orientations and the values of the children that are being brought up in that new set of life circumstances, influenced by some of those modernization forces. So it's important to keep in mind at what scale these are occurring. So just quickly to conclude, I want to show you a couple of quick examples of the implications of these findings for how we think about the conflict that's occurring over wildlife issues in today's society. There are two main areas where wildlife value orientations tend to be influential at the individual level. So the first is in how they affect people's behavior in a wildlife context. Here's one example of our findings looking at people's participation in wildlife-related recreation activities over the past year. And you see that utilitarians and pluralists are more likely to engage in hunting and fishing activities, whereas mutualists are higher on the wildlife viewing participation. So we see a difference there in terms of overall behavior. Now here's the last example. This is showing you how wildlife value orientations can have an influence on people's attitudes or their responses toward wildlife-related issues. Here's one example from our survey looking at how people are responding to a nuisance situation where black bears are getting into trash and pet food containers, a common situation in many parts of the western U.S. We see it oftentimes right now in Colorado. Along the x-axis, you have different actions that we asked about, and these were population-level control strategies that the agencies were interested in getting public input on. You have the action do nothing to control the bears, provide more recreational opportunities to hunt bears, and then conduct controlled hunts using trained agency staff. When you look at the acceptability of those actions by the different value types, we have relative consensus on the unacceptability of doing nothing. But then when we look at more of a lethal control mechanism, specifically one involving hunting, we see a pretty clear division among the groups. Over 50% of utilitarians and pluralists are accepting of that as a management strategy in that situation, whereas well under 50% of distanced and mutualists responded that way. There's some more consensus when we look at who's doing the hunting, the controlled agency staff, but there's still that same general pattern with lower levels of support among mutualists. So what this shows is how value orientations can form the foundation for conflict over wildlife-related issues. So to conclude, evidence suggests that wildlife value orientations are changing in the western U.S., and it's part of a broader value shift. As I mentioned, we only have cross-sectional data, but we do plan to replicate this study within the next 5 years to actually be tracking change. Right now we just have the baseline information for helping agencies better understand the publics that they serve. We're seeing a shift from utilitarian to mutualism wildlife value orientations. The change is rooted in basic culture shift that's caused by modernization, changes in economy, technology, and demography. And the reason why it's important to try to get a handle on this and be sort of proactive in understanding what's happening is the shift is thought to be at the root of conflict over management issues, declines in hunting, growth of ballot initiatives, and so on. Wildlife value orientations, as I just briefly alluded to in today's presentation, can be a useful segmentation tool for monitoring trends and also understanding and representing diverse publics. Having this kind of information, particularly at more local levels, which is one of the things that we're working on right now, collecting this information at finer degrees of resolution, can help in anticipating conflict that's going on the ground and help with being more proactive in terms of where to target your communication and outreach initiatives. And also just, understanding the social context of wildlife management and how that might be changing. So with that, I'll conclude.
Time for one question? Patty?
Your last couple of sentences actually started to answer my question, but I feel like the research is great. It gets right down to the point, but there's one thing that I'm curious about where it's headed is, what about the role of education in changing people's perceptions of wildlife? For instance, the bear problem that you showed there's also the option of educating people that own trash cans so that the bears aren't in them. So I feel like that maybe that's your next step with this, is you can actually not just observe cultural shifts and plot them, but you can actually affect them locally. So are you going in that direction?
Yes, that's a great question. And so if we look at the bear example, we can have information like what I presented as a way of informing educational initiatives, because you can look on the landscape, on the ground, and actually look at where there are certain kinds of attitudes and use that information to make sure that your educational initiatives are more targeted and that they're based on trying to appeal to the different value types that are out there. But I should mention that when we talk about value orientations, these are formed at a very early age. They tend not to change much over the course of an individual's lifetime. And so the only way to really impact value orientations, at least in my opinion, based on the work that we do and the research that we build upon, is to start at an early age with children. And one of the projects that we're working on right now, another initiative sponsored by WACWA, is to develop more targeted educational initiatives for connecting children and families to nature and to wildlife. And so we're looking at the different value types of various audiences in different regions of the United States, and we're trying to use that values information to create more targeted programs that can appeal to the value types, in connecting families to nature. But the attitudes, about the bears versus the value orientations, they're different concepts, and we use different things to affect them. But yes, you're correct. We can definitely use this information to inform education.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.